Welcome to the Carter Center's Forum on Human Rights roundtable discussion on the COVID-19 pandemic. We're glad to have you here today for our panel discussion featuring Radhika Balakrishnan, who is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Rutgers University. Welcome, Radhika. And we are really happy to have Phil Bloomer, the Executive Director for Business and Human Rights Resources Center. Welcome to Atlanta, Phil. It's a long trip. And we are really delighted to have Salimah Hankins, the Director of UN Implementation at the UN Anti-Racism Coalition. Welcome all the way from San Francisco. We're glad to have you here today. Today we are going to explore the issue of the exacerbating global inequality that has become evident for so many people around the world. The Carter Center is very interested in this topic because as president, Jimmy Carter signed the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These are very important United Nations treaties that were developed after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly right after World War II in 1948. And these are norms and standards that have really been the guiding star for human rights activists all over the world for really how to bring human rights into reality for more people. And so with the global pandemic coming, hitting everyone so hard, what we are seeing, of course, is that established trends have really gotten worse and worse. In the case of here in the United States, what we could see is that health impacts, I'm going to put up a couple of slides here for you. The health impacts have been really suffered in disparate ways, depending on which community you are a member of. Black people and Native American people have suffered the greatest losses in terms of hospitalization and death rate. And next slide, women, and particularly women of color, have been the frontline workers here in the United States that have suffered vastly inferior health protections, for example, protective equipment, et cetera. There are various ways that frontline workers were not protected from the virus, yet they couldn't afford to stay home. And so this, we see all of these global trends worsening and worsening. Final slide will show you how the global inequality, these are two examples I gave from the US, but we have really a global pandemic of economic inequality that has affected the world. Economists all over the world have agreed that there's really an inequality virus. I think this phrase is very suitable because here's just an example. It took 9 months for the fortunes of the top 1,000 billionaires to return to their pre-pandemic highs, while for the world's poorest, recovery might take more than a decade. The increase of wealth of the 10 richest billionaires since the crisis began is more than enough to prevent anyone on earth from falling into poverty because of the virus, and to pay for all COVID vaccines for all people. And when asked, economists all over the world agreed that these inequalities are going to worsen. And including for gender, in areas of gender inequality, that women will take much longer to recover from this pandemic. So we're really looking at a global problem, and I'd like to bring our panel in to take us through this and how we might really mobilize and organize to address some of these disparities. So Professor Balakrishnan, why don't you give us a good start here and talk about the trends from the past and how those have been exacerbated by the pandemic.
I will. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm really looking forward to an exciting conversation with some great people. I completely agree with you. The inequality that this pandemic has increased, but it also kind of made visible the existing inequality that was already there, right? We were watching suddenly care workers going in and people clapping their hands because they were working during the pandemic. And what it made was visible something that already existed. So I'm going to use a couple examples in the U.S. just to show that this is a historic uh, structure of inequality that has existed for a very long time. So if I could see the first slide. So this is a number in the US. And so this is changes in real family income by quintile and the top 5%. And this is from 1947 to 1979. And, you know, to just break it down, it just says that the people at the bottom 20% of real income, their family income, went up by 116%. The middle went up 100%. The second, and then the top still went up 86%. So within the kind of capitalist economy that we have in the United States, what we see is a increase in real income by quintile that's shared across all quintiles, and a little bit unequal, but basically everyone sort of prospered. And then something happened in 1980. President Carter did not win that election. And look what happened between, and this is 1979 to 2009. I looked for one that's more updated, but I couldn't find a graphic that was so visible. But you look from 1979 to 2009, the bottom just dropped to 7.4% below, and the top 5% went up 72.7. And I can tell you, I mean, even though I don't have the graphic right here, that from 2009 to now, that top has just gone skyrocketed, and not just the 5%, but the 0.1% has just gone out of control. So it's a structural problem of inequality. And if you could see the third slide. And look at this. I mean, I think this really tells you that there's something really wrong with our system, right? Our economic system as we exist right now does not work. So from 1950 till about 1980, you see sort of a shared prosperity. I mean, lots of inequality based on race and gender. I'm not trying to negate that. But overall, you see that there's sort of an economic policy that worked a little bit. And then you start in 1980 and you see that top percent just going off the charts in terms of increase in real income. And so I think we need to look at this historically and post-COVID as to what in economic inequality. And then the last graph, this is billionaires' wealth is skyrocketing during the pandemic. I mean, look at this. It's, and it's now on mainstream media how, 5 people have more wealth than everyone else, and how during this pandemic, they made more money during the pandemic and everyone else lost. So we really need to look at these issues as structural, historic, and what we need to do to really bring this economy back so that it works for us and fits into some of the promises of economic and social rights and economic policy. So we can take that down, and maybe Phil wants to jump in here in terms of the kind of corporate. I led you to the corporate takeover.
Thank you very much, Radhika. That's those graphs are extraordinary and illustrative, I think, of the challenges that we face in societies around the world, because those same graphs are effectively shared across the world in terms of those trends. I think I'd like to start where you left off, in a sense, and say that it's recognized that we're not in the golden age of globalization. In the public's mind, global markets are generally associated with profound and growing inequality, as you just demonstrated, climate breakdown, stagnant wages, and indeed rootless corporations that do not see any responsibility to any particular society or indeed any society. So the markets since the 1980s in particular have become focused almost entirely on the short-term return to shareholders and maximizing that short-term return, often at the expense of the rights of workers, communities, and of course the environment. And in a sense, the chickens are coming home to roost now. but they've been, as both of you have illustrated, the impact of those last 40 years has really been exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic. I mean, let me give you just a few examples from our work and our partners' work on, for instance, the apparel industry. You know, the clothes that are in all our wardrobes that we're wearing probably today as well. You know, the situation is that as soon as the pandemic hit, the fashion brands, because they have such a strong domination of the market, were able to say, we invoke force majeure clauses in our contracts, and so we won't be paying for the clothes that you've manufactured for us. And they told that essentially to a whole host of suppliers across Asia. Of course, what the suppliers then said to the workers is, well, you won't be getting paid for the clothes that you've manufactured. 1.6 million garment workers across Asia were laid off pretty much overnight. And the garment workers in Asia are still owed around $12 billion. Now, add that to the graphs that you've just illustrated, and you can see the way the pandemic is exacerbating that inequality. The way that the risks generated by the pandemic, as well as the costs generated by the pandemic, have essentially been pushed down the supply chain of fast fashion to be accumulated in the poorest and most vulnerable sections of the supply chain, those that are weakest in terms of their negotiating power, which are, of course, the women workers of Bangladesh, of Cambodia, Myanmar, etc. So that's the dynamic that the pandemic set up in the global markets, which only replicates that extraordinary inequality, Radhika, that you started your presentation with. I do want to say one more thing, though, about the pandemic, which is that it's not all doom and gloom. You know, the pandemic is creating new opportunities, which we must all grab hold of. You know, there is the California Garment Workers Protection Act, for instance, is the first of its kind around the world that actually insists that there's joint liability for the factories and the brands to pay a living wage for workers. Now, that's been led by the workers' groups. Again, the Tariff Act in the United States is imposing import bans on goods that are manufactured by essentially forced labor that's been trafficked into factories in places like Malaysia. So, and in the European Union, we have a whole host of legislation being pushed through on human rights and environmental due diligence. Now, the reason this is happening is because I think it's partly because the state is back, because the state has had to respond to the pandemic. It is now seen as important, but it's also the rise of the authoritarian populists has put the fear of God in centre-right and centre-left parties, particularly in Europe and the United States, but also in many emerging economies, to say we have to start making the state work for the majority. And we need to start taking much more radical, assertive measures to redirect markets away from the climate breakdown that we're living through, but also the profound and obscene and unsustainable inequality that's grown up over the last 40 years.
Oh, that's a perfect segue, yeah, and into this part of this discussion that we want to go into, which is, you know, the state is back. I love being able to say the state is back as sort of a bookend to Bill Clinton's the age of big government is over. Remember that from the mid-90s? Like that was some kind of triumph. And then just a couple of years ago, the World Bank came out with this analysis that the neoliberal economic model has failed most people. So I think you're right, Phil. I like that we have opportunities and we can be optimistic. I wanted to ask, or at least, you know, we reserve some of our energy for being optimistic. I should say it that way. So I wanted to ask Salimah, because, you know, another form of inequality that we have been dealing with over the pandemic is really coming to terms, and I would say in my country, it's mostly white people becoming aware of the disparities in how the state interacts with the Black population. In the case of police violence, this is the sharpest edge of the state's action versus vis-a-vis the population, right? This is where one person, one police officer can be judge, jury, and executioner all in 12 seconds. And so this is the sharp edge of the state. And when we look at these intersecting rights, we see the rising awareness about police violence against Black people, but it has also forced us to look at these structural inequalities. And King, at the end of his life, Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, one of America's greatest citizens, at the end of his life, what did he do? He started shifting to economic rights, the Poor People's Campaign. Realizing that these things are absolutely inextricably linked, and that it's fine to have the right to vote, but what about the rest of the rights? Salimah, can you talk to us about these intersecting rights?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, I just want to kind of piggyback on what was said before about the fact that the pandemic has exacerbated and laid bare all of these inequalities that have existed, and that it has presented a unique opportunity for us to really take stock of what we value. And I think for folks who are have been marginalized, we, as you said before, we've already sort of known about these issues around inequality, and particularly as it relates to like housing, workers' rights, education, all of these things that advocates on the ground have been fighting for a while. I think what feels unique about this moment is that advocates are seeing the human rights framework as a useful tool and an avenue to advocate for their issues. I think that the issue that many folks on the ground, grassroots folks, have about human rights, generally speaking, or the perception of it, is that it is something that kind of happens over there. There's this idea of like American exceptionalism. And I think that what the pandemic has done is it has actually helped to shift the narrative from one of individual responsibility to one of sort of this understanding of like a collective harm and a systemic harm. And I think that has actually been really, really useful. Many of our advocates focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, even if they're not necessarily aware that is the framework. And I think what has been useful is that combination. Like, people understand on a fundamental level about fairness and what is right and what is wrong, right? But then you have this collection of laws under the Constitution that is very limited, right? It doesn't necessarily include those economic, social, and cultural rights. So people have a sense of a kind of a moral sense of what is considered like just and unjust, but the laws don't actually match that. So then you bring in this human rights framework, and it clearly articulates the things that our activists are fighting for, and it doesn't require them to take on an additional burden or an additional work in order to achieve their aim. So that's why I feel like it's a very useful framework. I'll say a lot of advocates on the ground right now are focused on narrative shift. And even though that seems like for a lot of people a luxury, the idea is that you have to shift the narrative, and then after that you can sort of like work to shift policies. But the narrative was one of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you couldn't pay your rent, if you couldn't hold down a job, that there was something like individually wrong with you, right? And then this human rights framework says no. Essentially, the world has agreed, even though various countries around the world have like ratified different treaties. It's like the world in essence has agreed that economic, social, and cultural rights are important and essential to the honoring of civil and political rights, and we haven't recognized that. And so advocates are using that framework, going to the UN, and then using the the advantages or the attention that they get from the UN to actually make changes on the ground back home.
Exactly. And I think what's interesting is that both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, at the end of their lives, started talking about going to the United Nations as a human rights, bringing the civil rights issue, enlarging it and broadening it to a human rights issue. It was very interesting if you study that part of both of their lives. They said, wait a minute, we are in a global struggle. And this is really a question of solidarity, but also of norms that have been agreed to. One of the most interesting stories I came across was Nelson Mandela in 1944 reacting to Winston Churchill and FDR during the Atlantic Charter, when the Atlantic Charter was put out I think it was 44, around there. Where it was the precursor to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is anti-tyranny, we're against tyranny, we're for people. And Nelson Mandela, a young lawyer somewhere in South Africa, said, oh, really? You're interested in fighting tyranny and for the people? Okay, just you wait, we're coming, And so those global ideas that link us together, I think Martin Luther King and Malcolm X both saw this as an opportunity really to create solidarity and progress, make it a human cause. So I think that's a terrific, and I'm glad to hear, Salimah, that more and more activists in the US are thinking about how to use the UN system, and maybe we could hear more about that in the program later. So my second question is, I'm going to start with Radhika on this one, because you've done a lot of thinking and writing about this question, which is, what and who is the economy for? What is the economy for? Who is the economy for? And how do we change the answer to that question? How do we change it?
Okay, I mean, if I knew how to change it, we wouldn't be here, but at least there's a process by which we can think about how to change it. I mean, I think, and Karin, we've talked about this before. It's a project that I've been working on for a while. It's a very simple question. What is the economy for? We all participate in it. For whose benefit, right? And so it's a simple question, but a very profound and radical question. And I just looked up the Forbes list of the richest people in the world. The wealthiest exploded to an unprecedented 2,755, an increase of 660 more than a year ago during the pandemic, when the entire world economy collapsed. So there's something profoundly wrong about the way in which this economy is structured. So if we say, what is the economy for and what is its purpose, I think we're at a moment, and I think you'd all agree, that the whole world is seeing the collapse of all the kind of existing values that we've had and everywhere in the world. I think Salimah's your example, Philip's your example of the garment workers. It's not working. And so as an economist, I think it's a really important time to ask the normative question, what is it for? Because what it's for right now does not work. And so what if we say that the purpose of the economy, the way we're going to evaluate the economy, is not just looking at GDP growth, but looking at the fulfillment of economic, social, and cultural rights that are intertwined with civil and political rights? Because both Salimah and Karin, Phil, all of you have talked about the rise of kind of nationalist right-wing governments all around the world. But what if we evaluated the economy in terms of the fulfillment of human rights? A few countries have been looking at well-being rather than GDP. The OECD has actually got data on looking at well-being. But I think the human rights framework gives us this normative framework by which we can judge the economy. And Karin, you talked about, the days of Bill Clinton talking about the days of big government are over. But in that moment of big government are over, big government came and deregulated the financial sector so that we ended up in a crisis. So, right, when do you want government? Well, you want government when You want to give the richest of the world any kind of access to money, less taxes. I mean, the Trump tax cuts or just went through, whereas trying to put social programs in place is like, oh, that's too much government and government's interfering. But the other historic change during COVID was the minute it hit and there was a crisis, who had to step in? Everyone, all the neoliberal policies suddenly said, oh, government, please come in, right? When they were saying no government, no government. And then suddenly, yeah, please, government, give us some money. You got to come up with a thing. And then now that we're in this place and government stepped in, gave money to the pharmaceutical industry to try and come up with a vaccine, who gets the profit? Those industries, right? Our tax money went to support the research that gave us the vaccines, but they're not regulated. So, financial regulation, any kind of regulatory role of the government is so critical at this moment. The social welfare role of the government is happening in some countries. It's not happening in other countries because of international dynamics, the IMF, though they're talking about having to change their neoliberal structural adjustment in terms of the implementation on the ground, are continuing the same kind of policies they always have in a moment where we need some kind of real structural change to be able to deal with this crisis. I mean, I teach right now, and it's very hard to sort of explain. The world economy collapsed, but the richest people are flying planes into space. What sense does that make? So I think the normative framework of human rights, the fulfillment of human rights, both civil and political and economic, social, and cultural rights, is the normative frame that I think we can use to evaluate the economy and hold our states to account, and also to have an international agreement, because we can't do it nation state anymore. We have to have an international framework by which we can hold the entire world economy to account. And I'm moved by the idea that the human rights framework is a really good normative framework that so many countries have signed on to. So it's not like, me, the feminist economist, coming and telling people what to do, but it's like, okay, you've all signed on to this. Let's make it matter to something that can be implemented, and people can go to the UN and to their states and hold them accountable for something that they've agreed to.
Exactly. And one other example, I think, to mention, I meant to say at the beginning, just look at the inequality in terms of the vaccine distribution. I don't have a graph on that, but it's really shameful how some countries like the US, European countries are reaching fantastic vaccination rates, even though there continue to be disparities. But much of Africa doesn't have access to the vaccines yet. And so there's this fight over whether the TRIP waiver, whether they should release these patents so that smaller manufacturers can start manufacturing vaccine. So and that again is a state role. And so that is another area of inequality. But I think, Radhika, this idea of really looking to the global normative system is really important. And I know, Salimah, you have worked with the UN, various UN bodies, and helped US-based organizations bring human rights issues to the UN. I think that this is really, really vital, because no one country can really fill these gaps on our own, right? I mean, maybe you could just tell the audience how it works. Like, what does the UN have to do with this? Like, how do grassroots groups actually access the UN? How would you bring your issue to the UN, and what would it result in for you as an advocate?
So the organization that I was executive director of before, the U.S. Human Rights Network, we looked at our role as being the liaison between grassroots folks and the UN, because the UN can be a place that's really inaccessible for grassroots groups. And so we would do a lot of the, translation, not just like linguistically, but also just in terms of like context for grassroots groups. So I would say there's the benefit for grassroots groups of having their issue taken up at the UN is that it does, like what I was saying before, that moral and narrative arc that's really important. The UN does have a certain amount of prestige and gets a certain amount of attention that advocates on the ground might not get. And I use the example of advocates who would be advocating for their issue, whether it be housing, workers' rights, immigration, and not necessarily making as much attraction with policymakers and people who are in positions of power on the ground. And then they would join our delegation and we would take them to the UN. Usually it's around a treaty body review. So it's the treaties that the US has signed and are reviewed on periodically. We organize folks around those treaty reviews and do trips to Geneva where we help to prepare grassroots groups to actually advocate for their issues at the UN. And usually that gets them a lot of attention. And then also the advocates do either stakeholder reports or these shadow reports saying like, this is what's actually happening on the ground around my issue. And then that usually the advocates will have specific recommendations, which be taken up by the UN, put in their reports and concluding observations. That is actually really important because then the advocate, when they get back home, they can say, listen, you know, we've been fighting for this issue at home. We took this to an international stage and the UN and the bodies at the UN actually agreed with us. Suddenly those advocates on the ground, they're now, their phone calls are being returned. They've gotten a lot of attention. They're able to get more media attention on the ground. So, and that actually helps to move their issue. And we've seen a lot of like, movement on issues based on that that cycle of kind of going to the UN. And so it really is, it's not changing the work that folks are doing, but it's giving them another tool. And again, the whole idea around narrative and moral high ground is really important for an advocate on the ground who's working on an issue to say, the United Nations said that my issue is not only important, but also that my human rights are being violated, or the human rights of the people that I am in community with being violated is actually really impactful. So that's the work that advocates generally do around the UN, like the UN and human rights. And I will say that it's the UN part, but it's also just the framework itself, right? For people to instinctively feel like, this thing is wrong. Like I shouldn't have to, you know, work 2 to 3 jobs to get by, or like we were talking about the income inequality and the fact that billionaires are making, you know, the wealth gap has increased so much. To have codified in law somewhere internationally that yes, this is what is happening is wrong, and that there is a framework to around how to think about it, I think is really powerful and appealing to advocates on the ground.
Yeah, and I think there are some really good examples I've seen over the years where advocates have gone to the UN, or a special rapporteur from the UN has gone to a country and highlighted an issue, and the government had to respond. Here in the US, you had the special rapporteur on extreme poverty, Philip Alston, came to the US, and it was in the news. You had all the leading politicians saying, how dare the UN come and comment on the situation in the United States? But it got a lot of attention. A lot of the activists got really mobilized. There was another example in a different, I think it was Dominican Republic, where they appeared before a committee, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this issue, the NGOs, the activists brought a development project to the committee and say, all these people will be displaced. And then the government had to interact with the committee, and they changed the plan for this particular housing development. So the UN can, it doesn't have any enforcement ability, but it actually can, like you say, change the narrative and give activists that extra boost. Sometimes that can really help with their campaigns. So, you know, it is exciting, and we will have opportunities to do that more and more. So I wanted to actually broaden the lens a little bit now and ask Phil, from your perspective, you know, how should we view, you know, we're talking about the global systems. Can you talk to us about this? how should we view the current global systems and structures that exist now, and how they have determined these outcomes that we're seeing? What changes to these systems must be made, and what's underway now to make these changes come about?
Yes, thanks. I mean, it's a very interesting segue from what Salimah and indeed Radhika was saying. For instance, just to complement what they've said, we take up 1,000 allegations of abuse a year from grassroots communities and grassroots workers regarding abuse, and the language of rights is the only one that we can go to the companies that are committing these abuses with, because it's a language that they have to respond to according to the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. So again, the power of that, whether it's an American company, Chinese, Indian, French, British, Brazilian, Nigerian, Myanmar, Burmese company, it doesn't matter. They all have to respond to those allegations if they're framed in that human rights language. But it's also the case that, of course, those allegations aren't going to change the system. They're going to potentially help communities and workers' groups. But we need to also be able to elevate that rights perspective into something that will generate systemic change in the world. And that's where I think we've got real opportunities over this next period, partly because of the extraordinary tumult that is within capitalism at the moment, and partly because of the extraordinary challenge of climate breakdown that's upon us. So for me, the financial crisis of 2008 and now the pandemic has created different perspectives where greater numbers of people understand that that any inequality is now unsustainable, and that the climate and the damage that we've done to our environment is also unsustainable. We can't address that with business as usual. So there has to be fundamental changes. And how do they happen? How do we generate an economy, as Radhika was saying, that redirects our markets towards common prosperity and common shared security and shared prosperity? The key thing there, I think, is for us to be able to, first of all, understand that this is all our work. All of us are involved in this. We need the investor community to make radical change in terms of what they demand as the owners of capital. What are they demanding from the companies that they invest in? We need the better companies to start to demonstrate and lead through voluntary action what is the future in terms of to demonstrate what's commercially viable, as well as a moral imperative in terms of the respect for human rights. We need workers and communities to be far more organized and assertive in the way that we speak to companies and investors and to governments. But for me, most of all, we need our governments, the elected governments that we give our power to now step up and start to do what they are just beginning to do, which is be more assertive and more robust in redirecting capital and markets to a future of shared prosperity and shared security and the end of climate breakdown. So, that's easy to say, but we can see, first of all, that we have to address this singular, slavish attachment to our economies basically being directed entirely to the short to maximize the short-term return to shareholders. That means basically rewriting corporate law to make sure that the duties of companies is to take into consideration all stakeholders, including workers. And secondly, it's about ensuring that we're changing the calculus of risk in companies. The human rights and environment due diligence law in the European Union is seeking to do just that. It's starting to say, if you are a major economic actor like a company or an investor, and you have not done your due diligence in identifying where you will create human rights risk to workers, to communities in your operations and supply chains, then you are exposing yourself to substantial prosecution with liability and penalties. What that does is in the C-suites, in the executive boardrooms, it means that when these allegations come up, which for instance we take up all the time, they cannot be ignored. The calculus of risks changes because there can be litigation. So it's efforts like that that are going to be important. As I mentioned before, the California Garment Workers Protection Act. We've got to redirect capital through the investors themselves, ESG as it's called, environment, social and governance. But at the moment, there's a rise of ESG investment. And I'll finish with this, but there's a rise of ESG investment in the world. People want their savings to be directed towards sustainable environmental protection and social goods. But at the moment, of course, there's no definition of what a good investment is. That's why, for instance, right now, the European Union and to some degree other governments are starting to try and define what really consists of a portfolio. So we can't be sold a load of nonsense. But at the moment, it's those kind of ways, I think, that we can start to generate some of these systemic changes that are absolutely vital to our future.
Well, that's very hopeful in the sense that it really emphasizes the role of the activist community to really surface these allegations, to do good research, good fact finding, and bring those forward, and including through the UN and straight to the companies, to shareholder meetings, etc. I think that's absolutely right. And there's a dimension. I was just thinking about this because there's the that side of the state's interaction, but then there is this rise of authoritarianism that is having all kinds of implications. Number one, what you see is that I think we in the human rights world have, and Philip Alston made this case over and over for years, is that we really, by not showing these linkages between these various rights, that economic well-being of all is going to bolster our work for political inclusion, et cetera, that we have made people cynical about power. So when authoritarian comes along and say, yeah, you're gonna go to trade, gonna have a trade war with China, perfect. That'll help me. I don't care if you kill immigrants at the border, or if you crack down on free expression, et cetera. So this has led to this crisis that we're in. But at the same time, activists are having this, it is a crisis that's producing more advocacy and good activism. So of course, the hard side of that is with the rise of authoritarianism, along with that comes the rise of violence and state violence. So different facets of state violence are warfare and militarization of policing, right? These are other areas of the economy. You talked about climate change. More and more people have been talking about the fact that militaries are exempt from climate discussions. We don't look at the fact that the United States military has more emissions than 140 countries combined. So that's excluded from climate talks. The whole question of national security. So. That's on the war front, but also in our communities, we have a militarization of police. And another form of inequality has arisen, which is showing that people of African descent, which is a group that is being really highlighted by the UN right now as being really at the other end of another form of discrimination. If Jason, you could put up that final slide, which shows that the impact of lethal police violence is much greater for Black people in the United States. But this is a global phenomenon. It's another form of inequality that is intersecting with everything that Phil just described as where our investments are going, where are companies acting, how are they acting, and how are their actions affecting communities. So this is just a graph that shows the line at the top. This is the disparate impact of fatal police violence against African Americans in the United States. It's just a US example. But Salimah, can you talk to us about the UN Accountability Project and how you hope that bringing this issue of inequality vis-a-vis the people of African descent throughout the world, how what's happening at the UN and how activists are working on this.
Thank you. I think it's also important to say that all of the increase in police violence against people of African descent is happening while we're in the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. So the idea around this decade was that we were going to look at issues, or really anti-Blackness globally, and the intersections, whether it be around civil and political rights, and also economic, social, and cultural rights. And I think obviously last year, I had done a lot of work with the families of people killed by police before the pandemic. But this last year was really different. And I think, there are a lot of reasons why I think people are paying attention more now than they were before. But it has provided an opportunity, while it's really tragic, it has provided an opportunity for us to really highlight and push at the UN level issues around police violence and its connection to systemic racism. So we want to make sure that we don't separate those two things. That and to show that these are not, even though we're in the middle of the pandemic, this is not an isolated. These are not isolated incidences. This is a part of the long history of policing in the U.S. and globally. When you think about the origins of policing in the United States, and them being sort of based in these slave patrols, right? It's like, who are the police meant to serve? So last year, after the killing of George Floyd, it was obviously very, very devastating for folks, for folks globally, but particularly for folks in the U.S. who are working on issues around police violence. And so my former organization, and along with some other organizations, decided to bring the issue of the killing of George Floyd to the UN and ask for a special session. And basically, this is something that has never happened. Like a G8 country has never been subject to a special session, which is basically a special process that would look at the killing of George Floyd, and it was like the targeting of activists around the protest and the systemic issues in a emergency context. Like these are the type of sessions that happen with regard to in the Middle East, Latin America, and things like that. So we actually worked with the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and other folks, and submitted a letter, sent it, and I think within 2 days, we got 690 organizations globally to sign on to the letter. We sent it off to the Human Rights Council asking for a special session. Because they were in session, they decided to make it an urgent debate, which is the same thing. We were pretty disappointed in terms of the outcomes, particularly because George Floyd's brother actually did a testimony to open up the session, basically saying we want you to take action. We wanted a international commission of inquiry. We didn't get that, but we did get that they said that the High Commissioner would gather evidence and then submit a report. That actually happened. And then there was some advocacy. The coalition that I now work for was formed as a result of this advocacy work. And so what was created, I'm trying to make a long story short, what was created was a new mechanism, temporary, but a new mechanism that would be singularly focused on systemic racism and police violence against Africans and people of African descent globally. And my coalition is charged with making sure that is actually effective and works well for the grassroots folks around the world, globally, Black organizations who are working on systemic racism. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that came from the report, the High Commissioner's report, which I think was really interesting, is of all the research they did, they looked at 190 cases in different countries around the world. They basically said that no state, not one state, is actually effectively addressing systemic racism and police violence. And even though against Black people, people of African descent and Africans around the world. And then they gave sort of like this 4-point agenda for what things needed to be addressed. They said, number 1, dismantling systemic racism. Number 2, ending impunity for law enforcement for violations. Number 3, to ensure the voices those who are impacted are heard. And then the important thing is to confront these past legacies of colonialism and slavery, and making sure that there's actually accountability and redress. So that's a tall order, and the coalition is working on ways to ensure that we are able to hold the UN accountable, but also the states that these coalition members are in, to hold them also up to the human rights standards that's been created by this mechanism.
That's fantastic. I think, look at what you and your coalition have made out of this opportunity. It's an amazing opportunity. And I think that for the UN to say no state is actually tackling it is a wide open door for there to be solidarity among activists, et cetera. And it sort of brings us around, as we're in our last 9 minutes here in the discussion, to say, for example, like to Radhika's question, what is the economy for? Shouldn't we be investing in our communities in a way that balances human rights, the human right to safety? Yes, we have a human rights to be safe in our communities. We also have a human right to not be executed extrajudicially by the police. We have a right to access to affordable housing. We have a right to quality education, to food, to clean water. These rights that we have, if we were to readjust and answer Radhika's question, the economy is for human beings to have well-being and to enjoy their human rights to all of these things that we've agreed to, right? So where are we failing? If even the most advanced democracies, advanced economies are not addressing systemic racism, then we're in trouble. We haven't made the progress. And so we have to really think about how to recalibrate this question about the economy. So let me turn it back over to Radhika for any final thoughts, and to Phil as we wrap up. And before we do, I don't want to surprise anyone here, but if Jason could come on screen at some point in the next 5 minutes, we want to wish him a happy 50th birthday today. Jason. Happy 50th.
Hi.
Sorry,
Thank you.
On Instagram.
Happy
Thank you.
That's our Jason behind the scenes. Happy 50th. But back over to you, Radhika. How do we bring all these ideas together in that great question, what is the economy for?
Well, I think, and Phil has been reminding us over and over again about climate change. And so I think we need to broaden this idea of what is the economy for beyond human beings, because I think we are part of this world, including nature. And so how do we make the economy that just doesn't destroy the world in order so that human beings can consume more stuff? So I think we need to really put climate change at the center of the issue. And one of the things about climate change, in some ways that's good, is that it affects the rich people as well. I mean, they might go into space, but I don't think it's that breathable out there. So I think it might actually be the catalyst that might shift something around, because they're going to get flooded. The fires are burning down their houses as much as they are the poor. So I think that's true. And then one UN conference that doesn't get talked about it very much, and Salimah, your conversation really brought that to my mind, is the World Conference Against Racism that happened 20 years ago, where we all came together, and talked about how do we deal with systemic racism across, the US, Palestine, the Dalits in India. It's like, it was such an amazing moment, and I was there. And then we came back to 9/11, and then the world changed in the way we all know. So the one thing that I wanted to end with in terms of the human rights framework, and one of the positive aspects that I find very moving is that the human rights framework doesn't just talk about the equality of opportunity. It talks about substantive freedoms, right? And substantive freedoms are holistic. They're not just sort of, yes, I can have more access to a job somewhere in the market, but a substantive freedom and realized outcomes, right? Not just sort of here, we can invest more in this and therefore maybe but the framework says realized outcome. And the last thing I'll say is that the human rights framework is a collective obligation for an individual right. So that those of us, who are, for example, women, and I haven't, it's kind of amazed that I didn't talk about the care economy and what's happened with, COVID and unpaid care work, but it's the individual right that we have a collective responsibility, and that's national and global. So that's why I find it a promising framework to kind of answer that question, what is the economy for? And it should be for the fulfillment of not just human rights, but planetary, some kind of, I don't even know what the word is, an equality of us with the planet. Because we're kind of the worst people we're the worst thing in the planet right now in terms of what's happening to it. So
yeah. Well, thank you. And Phil, I know that you're concerned about how the climate movement, the climate change movement may affect people who are already living with great inequality. Do you want to address that question as we wrap up as well? And you're on mute there. If you can take yourself off of mute. Yeah.
Good. Still struggling with the mute button as ever. Thanks very much, and I think that's a great segue. I'll be very brief because we don't have the time, but it's just to say that we have to go through an extraordinary transition over the next 9 years. That's all we've got to make this extraordinary transition that is necessary. If we're going to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade and therefore have the likelihood, and it's only a likelihood, of not having catastrophic climate change upon us, where there are fundamental changes and much of the earth becomes pretty uninhabitable. The situation is that through that just transition, we have a choice. We either have a very unfair transition where the costs of that transition are passed down, as I was talking earlier, passed down to the poorest and weakest members, who will naturally resist. And therefore we get a very slow transition. Or we need a just transition, which will be fast and fair, because we have to distribute the enormous benefits that will come from this transition in terms of new jobs in clean industries, in terms of better housing, and all the other aspects that can come with that, better health, and share also that sense of the risks that are there. If we can do that, then there is a real opportunity ahead of us. At the moment, we've got to help workers, for instance, in the dirty industries of fossil fuel and cement, coal mines, etc. They will naturally resist unless they know there is going to be social protection for them, and there will be retraining. If that's available, they're likely to want to move into better jobs that have a longer term future. If not, if they're going to be thrown on the scrap heap again, and in the rust belts of America, now the coal belts of America, as happened in Europe as well, there will be a natural resistance and an understandable resistance to a deeply unfair process. Equally, now we've got the opening up of clean energy, massive expansion. But it will either be fair or it will and fast, or it will be slow. Again, the sector with the fastest rising number of abuses that we are registering as we take up 1,000 allegations a year is the renewable energy sector. Transition minerals like lithium, cobalt, copper, manganese, nickel, these are being extracted at the expense of communities, taking their land and their water. Equally, renewable energy is being deployed in indigenous communities, in Afro-descendant communities, where the land is simply being confiscated. Land grabs and land theft is occurring because enormous increases are being enormous returns to investors are being promised. So we've got to get this back under control and drive a fair transition if we're going to get a fast transition.
Well, that is a fantastic mission statement and marching orders. And Salimah, the last word to you. I know you have to run, but any last minute thoughts or advice?
No, just to say that it was actually beautifully said by Phil and Radhika. And yeah, I think this was a great conversation and I appreciate being a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience. I think we have lots of ideas to chew on and to go and get active. Thank you so much and stay in touch. I think we need to do roundtables on each one of these topics that we've just cracked open because each of them deserves a full hour. Thank you all. And have a wonderful day and happy 50th birthday, Jason.
Yeah, happy birthday.
Happy birthday and thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.